So this is my second video as a part of the final project. This time I'm going to be talking about Wigger's diagram and how we kind of interrelate cardiac pressure, cardiac volume throughout our myocardial tissue, how it's going to relate to electrical conduction throughout our myocardial tissue, and then at the very end we will talk about what kind of implications physiologically that atherosclerosis actually has on this. So we'll start out with an EKG. So you've got vagal tone, you've got your P wave, your QRS complex, and then you've got your T wave. That's a weird looking complex, but we'll just keep going with it. And then we'll do a second one, P wave, QRS complex, and then another T wave. So that's atrial depolarization, QRS is ventricular depolarization, and then your T wave is your ventricular relaxation or repolarization. I'll label these again. So we will start out by talking about kind of the pressures throughout the heart. Obviously, we'll talk about atrial pressure first. So at your resting tone here, as you're leading up to your P wave, this is atrial diastole, which means that your atria are filling with blood, which means your intraatrial pressure is rising. So from here, we're rising pressure, rising pressure, rising pressure. And right here at this moment of depolarization, our pressure is going to drop because our atria are going to be pumping blood into our ventricles. So they're going to drop and then they're going to come back down very, very slowly down to this kind of resting tone of pressure. And then as our ventricles start to relax kind of along this T wave here, we're going to see this gradual increase of pressure again as we go back into diastole, or our atrial diastole. So that's our atrial pressure. So we'll do AP, and we'll move on to ventricular pressure. Ventricular pressure is going to be kind of the same thing. It's going to look a little bit different, obviously, because the ventricles are having a much higher ejection fraction. They're going to have a lot more volume pumping out, simply because the ventricles are larger chambers. And it's going to be displaced on our EKG diagram because obviously our ventricles contract and produce systole after our atria produce systole. So from here, we will have low pressure, and then kind of from the point of our atria, depolarizing and contracting, as blood starts to pool into our ventricles, we're going to see that pressure rise, 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 rise. And then right here, at the point where our ventricles depolarize, we're going to see it shoot up really, really high. And then actually a little bit after that, we're going to see where our aortic valve opens up, and also our pulmonary valve, but mainly we're talking about our aortic valve open up. And that's where this peak pressure starts to hit and starts to come down again, because that's when actually all of the blood starts to leave the ventricles and go out of the aorta and out of our pulmonary arteries. And so that's the point where we'll see this pressure come down drastically. And obviously the size difference here is because there's a much greater pressure exerted on our intraventricular space, again, because our ventricles have much more myocardial mass, they have much more muscle mass, and they're carrying a lot more blood than our atria are. It's also worth mentioning here too, that atrial pressure does have a little bit of a rise here. It's not really super notable, but it's worth mentioning simply because as the ventricles begin to contract, as they begin to depolarize and push blood out towards the valves to leave the heart, there's actually a small amount of pressure exerted back on your tricuspid valve and your mitral valve, simply due to the blood being pushed up against those valves. It's really, really not super measurable, obviously, compared to actual depolarization, but it's worth mentioning. So then again, just like our atrial pressure, our ventricular pressure will kind of come back down to resting. And it'll actually, for a while here, it'll take a while longer because we can have empty ventricles, but our ventricles will still be kind of contracted. And as we have that diastole period of them opening up, that's when their pressure will kind of reduce until they're eventually filled with blood again. And just like with our atrial pressure, we kind of have it displaced here again a second time. So that's our ventricular pressure. In line with these, we can talk about atrial and ventricular volume. We'll talk about atrial volume first. So atrial volume will be rising, rising, rising. And just like our pressure, kind of right about here, it's going to start to dip off super quickly as it pumps out. And then it's going to go down to our resting line. And then from our ventricles contracting, they're going to pump out that blood. And then as the ventricles are relaxing, we're going to rise, 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 rise. And then right at that P wave, right at that atrial depolarization, right at that atrial contraction, when we open up those tricuspid and mitral valves, we're going to see that steep loss in blood volume. So that's our atrial blood volume. And then we will go ahead and erase this, and we'll go ahead, I'm just going to redraw our EKG. And lastly, we'll talk about ventricular volume over time as it relates to our contractility. So we've got our EKG, our T wave, complex, and our T wave. And so here we will talk about ventricular volume. So obviously right here, when our atria are filling, our ventricular volume is kind of at that resting of 0. Obviously there is a little bit of what we call passive filling, which is essentially blood that is leaking into the ventricles, not like a leaky valve, but leaking into the ventricles by way of just passively transporting through the valves. It's something like 80% is due to passive filling, and only about 20% is actually from that atrial systole. And so actually, you know what, for this sake, we'll go ahead and redraw this, because here we're actually having about that 80% fill, and then right at the point of this kind of atrial depolarization, the atrial contraction, we'll see it go up a little bit more. And as it goes up, as your kind of contraction moves along with your atrial depolarization, we're going to see it go up a little bit more and wane off just a little bit. And then right about here at the point of our ventricular depolarization or ventricular contraction, we're going to see that steeply decline. And then it's going to go all the way down. And then as we have this T wave kind of hit, that's when we have our ventricles starting to relax and open back up. And there's a really small pressure differential in the heart that causes us a wee bit of a vacuum effect. And so our change in negative pressure from our ventricles kind of relaxing through diastole and opening up again is almost helping to facilitate that what we call passive filling that we talked about right here. And so right at this point of repolarization and relaxation of the ventricles is when we will see that start to kind of fill back up again, obviously until our next complex right there. So that's really the basics of Wigger's diagram. There's a couple other things that go into Wigger's diagram. There's noises if you're doing auscultation with a stethoscope. And if you're listening, the different noises that you'll hear throughout the heart are actually the different valves opening and closing. And those have their kind of own timing and implications with the heart and with the volumes and the pressures. But for now, we're going to keep it simple and just talk about EKG as it relates to volume and pressures. And now we will talk about atherosclerosis, which is when there is increased plaque throughout our arteries. A lot of the times we're talking about our coronary arteries, the arteries that feed our heart. But here we can talk about the veins as well that are leading up to the heart, and we can talk about the aorta, intra-aortal pressure being increased. And so for the sake of, we'll do another EKG, we got a P, QRS, and our T wave. And here we can talk about kind of the atrial filling. So our atrial filling is going to be slightly reduced only because we don't have as much of an easy flow through our veins, through our arteries, because they've got so much plaque buildup. And so our rate of filling is going to be slightly reduced. And so instead of, with a normal heart, we'll call this atrial blood volume, instead of having this bit here go up really quick like this and then dip off and do what it would, instead we're going to have a much slower, more gradual rise, because obviously your blood flow is going to be reduced, the amount of blood that you can put into your atria quickly during diastole. And because your atria only fill for so much time and you've got that reduced rate, you will also have a reduced kind of amount of blood volume. So instead of looking like this one, like a normal heart, we'll see more of this blood volume concentration. And a similar situation with ventricular volume. So we'll erase this, we'll do ventricular blood volume. That straight up wasn't a V. Ventricular blood volume. It's going to be a similar situation, but something actually really unique happens here. We'll have ventricular blood volume, and we'll also have ventricular pressure, intraventricular pressure. So in our ventricular blood volume, obviously because the amount of blood going into our atria is going to be reduced, we're going to have a lower kind of starting line for our ventricles. And because I'm not representing this on a quantitative numerical scale, you won't be able to appreciate that in full effect. But if you were to look at an actual Wigger's diagram of someone dealing with atherosclerosis, you would be able to see this quantified tangibly. But in this ventricular blood volume diagram, we can go ahead and look at it like this. So instead of, you're filling, passive filling, and then you've got this spike whenever we've got that atrial depolarization, that atrial contraction, and that's the point where we kind of shoot up in our blood volume, and then we wane off, and then as we reach our ventricular depolarization, our ventricular contraction, we immediately go down pretty slow. We'll actually go a little bit lower than we were before, and then we'll slowly gradually kind of go up, just like we did over to our P wave and our QRS complex before. In the case of atherosclerosis, obviously we'll have a lower resting line here. Well, I guess this would be 0 somewhere in here, but we'll say we'll start from 0. And again, you'll have kind of equal filling time in the ventricles, just because from your atria to your ventricles, the filling time is going to be the same because there's no arteries or veins specifically between those two. But your cap is going to be a little bit less, right? So we're going to cap off here instead. Now, this next part is going to be really, really interesting because we've got our intraventricular pressure rising kind of as we have more blood volume, and it peaks right as we start to depolarize, and it actually peaks a little bit past that whenever our valve actually pops open right about there, just after our depolarization, just after our contraction. But in the case of atherosclerosis, if you've got, let's say this is your aorta, right? And you've got a normal aorta with plenty of flow available, and let's say this is an aorta with atherosclerosis, and you've got all this plaque buildup, and let's say you can only get one arrow through. So obviously you've got a much higher pressure going through, what we call back pressure, which is the amount of pressure pushing back on our ventricular contraction from our aortic pressure. If we had a separate diagram for aortic pressure, our aortic pressure would actually be a lot higher because our ventricles are contracting the same amount and trying to push out the same amount of blood, but we've got so much less space with atherosclerosis than we do with a healthy aorta. So in our intraventricular pressure, we're actually going to see this go up even more than we would with a normal heart with normal non-atherosclerotic veins and arteries. And then also in this ventricular blood volume, we're actually going to see it not go as high, in part because of that back pressure, because we're trying to push this much out, and it's just increasing the pressure in here, which is actually in turn causing us to put pressure back on the blood flow from the ventricles, from the aorta. And so overall, we're not going to have as much blood pumped out, which obviously is a reduction in your ejection fraction, and that can lead to stuff like dizziness. That can lead to stuff like swelling in the legs, occasional claudication, and a whole mess of other situations and complications that can come with that condition. But really, this is going to be super, super important and super, super devastating whenever it comes to the effects of exercise. Because whenever we're exercising, we're trying to produce that ejection fraction even higher. We're trying to increase that heart rate, put out that stroke volume even higher. And we've already got a resting reduced stroke volume, but now in exercise, it's even more of a demand that we can't already meet at rest. And it's just going to be a devastating effect to the heart and the rest of the arteries and veins. So that is, in effect, Wigger's diagram. We talked about at base resting levels what ventricular and atrial blood volume look like in reference to atrial contraction depolarization and ventricular contraction depolarization. And then we also talked about intraventricular pressure and intraatrial pressure in terms of atrial depolarization and contraction and ventricular depolarization and contraction. And then lastly, we kind of summed it up with the effects of atherosclerosis and having that kind of increased blood pressure in the heart and having that sort of decreased stroke volume due to this reduced ability to fill during diastole. So that is it. Thank you so much.